The courtroom froze as 9-year-old Lily pointed at the man everyone trusted, her father. Gasps filled the room. "It wasn't my mom," she whispered. "It was him." The judge's gavel slammed, but the damage was done. Daniel Reeves's perfect lie was crumbling. What happened next? No one saw it coming. The courtroom, already tense, erupted into shocked whispers. Lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. Journalists scribbled frantically, and the judge's gavel came down hard against the bench. "Order! Order in the court!" Judge Simmons' voice cut through the noise, but the tension refused to settle. At the back of the room, Daniel Reeves sat frozen, his once confident smirk wiped clean. His hands, resting on his polished suit pants, clenched into fists. His lawyer, a sharp-looking man in his 50s, leaned in, whispering urgently, but Daniel didn't react. His eyes were locked on Lily, his daughter, the child he had never imagined would betray him. Mr. Walsh, the prosecutor, quickly composed himself, though the shift in his expression was unmistakable. Just minutes ago, he had been in full control, presenting Vanessa Reeves as an unfit mother, methodically building his case. Now, everything had changed. He cleared his throat, taking a step closer to the witness stand. "Lily," he said carefully, his voice losing some of its usual certainty. "Do you understand what you're saying?" Lily's small hands tightened around the armrests. The weight of every pair of eyes in the room pressed down on her, but she didn't look away. She nodded. "Yes." Vanessa, at the defendant's table, was shaking, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping the table so hard her knuckles had turned white. Her daughter's voice, so small yet so powerful, was the only thing breaking through the suffocating tension. Mr. Walsh hesitated. He had reviewed every detail of this case, every record, every witness statement. Lily's father had been the one who filed the complaint against Vanessa. The medical reports, the late-night hospital visits, everything pointed to a mother failing to protect her child. But what if they had it all wrong? He exhaled, regaining his composure. "Lily, you just told this court that your mother was trying to protect you. Are you saying that your father was the one who hurt you?" Lily glanced briefly at Vanessa, who was still frozen in shock. Then, with a deep breath, she turned back to the judge. "Yes." Another murmur rippled through the room. Daniel shifted in his seat, his mouth opening slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. The judge leaned forward. "Lily, I need you to be very clear. Are you accusing your father of hurting you?" Lily nodded again, her voice just above a whisper. "He told me not to tell anyone." The whispers turned into full conversations. Daniel's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. A child this young is easily manipulated." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Simmons snapped. His usual patience was gone. He turned back to Lily, his expression unreadable. "Sweetheart, can you tell me what you mean? What did your father do?" Lily hesitated. For the first time she looked unsure, her fingers gripping the seat so tightly they trembled. The silence stretched. Then, slowly, she lifted the sleeve of her sweater. Gasps filled the courtroom again. A large, fading bruise covered the inside of her forearm. Vanessa let out a quiet, broken sob. Mr. Walsh stiffened. He had seen this bruise in the medical reports. It had been used as evidence against Vanessa. But now, looking at the fear in Lily's eyes, he felt his stomach twist. The judge's expression darkened. "Lily, how did you get that bruise?" Lily swallowed hard. Her voice barely carried across the room. "Daddy was mad. I spilled something on his papers." Daniel shot up. "This is insane. She's making it up." The judge's gavel slammed down. "Sit! Down!" Daniel's lawyer reached for his arm, whispering frantically, but Daniel yanked away. His face was red, his jaw clenched. Mr. Walsh turned back to Lily. "Did this happen more than once?" Lily nodded. Did your mother know? She nodded again. She tried to stop him, but he told her if she said anything, he'd take me away. Tears streamed down Vanessa's face. She was shaking her head as if trying to convince herself this was real. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. You're really going to believe this? She's a kid. She doesn't even know what she's saying. Judge Simmons turned his cold gaze on Daniel. Mr. Reeves, I would strongly advise you to remain silent. Mr. Walsh stepped forward. Your Honor, given these statements, I request an immediate investigation into Mr. Reeves. There is reason to believe this case was deliberately misrepresented. Daniel's lawyer bolted up again. This is absurd. There is no evidence. Judge Simmons held up a hand. You're right. There isn't. Not yet. His gaze returned to Lily. But we're going to find out the truth. Lily exhaled, her tiny shoulders finally relaxing just a little. Vanessa reached for her lawyer's hand, gripping it like a lifeline, and Daniel Reeves, for the first time that day, looked truly afraid. Daniel Reeves's face flushed with anger, but there was something else, something deeper lurking behind his outrage. His jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck bulged. His lawyer leaned in again, whispering urgently, but Daniel didn't respond. His entire body was rigid, his gaze locked onto Lily, the daughter he had never imagined would betray him in front of a courtroom full of people. The air inside the courtroom felt thick, suffocating. The weight of Lily's words, of the bruise now exposed on her arm, settled over the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every person present, jurors, attorneys, the judge, was grappling with the same realization. They had been building a case against the wrong person. Mr. Walsh adjusted his tie, his usual air of confidence shaken. He was always in control, always one step ahead, but now his case had collapsed in an instant. He hesitated, flipping through his notes as if the truth might somehow be hidden between the pages of his perfectly structured argument. Lily, he began, his voice slower this time, more measured. You're saying that everything your father told us was a lie? Lily met his gaze. He always lies, she said simply. Vanessa, still seated at the defendant's table, let out a quiet, shaky breath, as if she had been holding it for years. Her hands trembled as she wiped at her tear-streaked face, but she didn't take her eyes off her daughter. Judge Simmons, who had spent decades presiding over cases filled with deceit and manipulation, studied Lily carefully. He had seen children coached into saying things, seen them confused by bitter custody battles. But the way Lily spoke, clear, deliberate, without hesitation, there was no mistaking it. This wasn't confusion. This was a child telling the truth, and no one had believed her until now. What do you mean, child? The judge asked, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. Lily hesitated. The weight of what she was about to say pressed down on her small shoulders. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater, knuckles white. Then, with a shaky breath, she reached for her sleeve and pulled it up. The reaction was immediate. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. One of the jurors covered her mouth in horror. A man in the audience murmured something under his breath. Even Mr. Walsh, who had spent years in courtrooms prosecuting criminals of every kind, felt his stomach drop. The bruise was deep, dark, and unmistakable. Daniel's lawyer shot up. Objection! This is highly improper. Judge Simmons's gavel slammed against the wood. You will sit down and remain silent, counselor. His voice was sharp, brooking no argument. Vanessa let out a muffled sob, one hand covering her mouth, her entire body trembling. Lily's eyes flickered toward her mother just for a second, before she turned back to the judge. He told me if I ever told anyone, I'd never see Mom again, she whispered. Daniel's fist slammed against the table. This is outrageous! The judge's sharp gaze snapped to him. Mr. Reeves, You will control yourself. Mr. Walsh, who had remained frozen for several seconds, finally found his voice. Your Honor, we need to recess. Judge Simmons lifted a hand. Absolutely not. We continue. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. He turned his full attention back to Lily. Tell me, child, when did this happen? Lily's eyes darted downward. A few weeks ago. Vanessa inhaled sharply. I told them, she whispered, almost to herself. I told them something was wrong. Mr. Walsh cleared his throat. Lily, did your father cause any other injuries? Lily nodded. Do you know why your mother took you to the hospital? Another nod. Did she ever hurt you? Lily shook her head. No. Mr. Walsh exhaled, his expression grim. The entire case against Vanessa had relied on those medical records. But if Lily's injuries hadn't been caused by her mother, then they had built their entire argument on a false premise. Daniel, still fuming, turned to his lawyer. Say something. Fix this. But his lawyer looked just as pale as the rest of them. Judge Simmons turned to Mr. Walsh. Did your team ever investigate Mr. Reeves? Mr. Walsh hesitated. No, Your Honor. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we failed this child. Vanessa let out a quiet sob. Lily reached for her mother's hand, gripping it tightly. Daniel's lawyer stood again, clearing his throat. Your Honor, this is getting out of hand. A child's testimony can be unreliable, especially in a high-conflict custody battle. There is no evidence that my client... Judge Simmons cut him off. We will determine that. A beat of silence stretched across the courtroom. Then the judge turned back to Lily, his voice softer now. Lily, can you tell me how often your father has hurt you? Lily hesitated. Daniel's jaw twitched. His entire body was coiled like a spring, ready to snap. A lot, she finally said. The air in the room felt suffocating. Judge Simmons sat back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but there was something steely in his eyes. He exhaled through his nose, then turned to the bailiff standing near the door. Escort Mr. Reeves out of my courtroom. Daniel shot up. You can't do this. One of the bailiffs stepped forward. Sir, we need you to come with us. Daniel's lawyer tried to intervene. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Judge Simmons didn't even look at him. Mr. Reeves, I suggest you don't make this harder on yourself. Daniel hesitated. His gaze flickered to Lily. His daughter. The child he thought he could control. She didn't look away. For the first time, Daniel realized he had lost. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, Vanessa pulled Lily into her arms. You were so brave, she whispered. Lily buried her face in her mother's shoulder. For the first time in months, she finally felt safe. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The weight of Lily's words pressed down on everyone like a crushing force. For weeks, Vanessa Reeves had been painted as the villain, a neglectful, abusive mother who had failed to protect her child. But now, with just a few words, her 9-year-old daughter had turned the case on its head. Daniel's lawyer, still standing, adjusted his tie, struggling to maintain control. Your Honor, this child is under immense pressure. We cannot take her statements at face value without corroborating evidence. His voice was steady, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. Lily, small but unshaken, turned her gaze directly to the judge. You need more evidence? She asked. Her tone was calm, not the desperate plea of a scared child, but the determined challenge of someone who had been ignored for too long. Judge Simmons, who had seen every kind of defendant, victim, and liar in his decades on the bench, studied her carefully. He had been in courtrooms long enough to recognize when a witness was confused, coached, or manipulated. Lily was none of those things. Still, he was bound by the law. Yes, he said, his voice measured. We cannot make decisions based on testimony alone. There must be supporting evidence. Lily inhaled deeply, then looked at Mr. Walsh. "You said my mom took me to the hospital a lot. Did you check why?" The prosecutor stiffened. The question cut deeper than anyone had expected. Mr. Walsh had spent years in prosecution, priding himself on airtight cases built on facts. He had relied on medical reports, social service records, and Daniel Reeves's statements to paint Vanessa as an unfit mother. But Lily's question had exposed the single flaw in his case. He had never asked what had really happened before those hospital visits. He hesitated. "The records show repeated injuries," he admitted. Lily didn't blink. "Did you check who caused them?" A ripple of unease spread through the room. The jury, previously so certain of Vanessa's guilt, shifted in their seats. Lawyers exchanged glances. Even the spectators in the gallery, who had come expecting a routine custody battle, felt the air change. Silence. Vanessa's breath hitched. For months, she had been screaming into the void, trying to make someone listen. And now, her daughter, a child who had spent too much of her life learning to survive, had just cracked the courtroom wide open. Judge Simmons exhaled deeply. He turned to Mr. Walsh, his voice sharp. "Did your office investigate the source of these injuries?" Mr. Walsh's jaw tightened. "The reports indicated negligence on the mother's part, that she failed to provide adequate supervision." Lily shook her head. "That's not true." Her words cut through the tension like a blade. The judge leaned forward. "Then tell us what is true." Lily's grip on the chair tightened. Her small fingers dug into the worn wood, her knuckles white. She turned toward the jury, toward the lawyers, toward the people who had been deciding her fate without ever asking her what she had been through. "You thought my mom hurt me," she said, her voice steady. "But she was the one trying to stop him." Her words sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Daniel, who had remained eerily silent for the last few minutes, let out a low, bitter laugh. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, the smug confidence returning to his face. "And now she's brainwashed my kid. Fantastic." His lawyer jumped in. "Your Honor, this is blatant manipulation. The child has clearly been influenced by her mother." Lily's head snapped toward them. "No, I haven't." Her voice was sharper now, firm. Daniel smirked, but it was weaker than before. Lily turned back to the judge. "If you don't believe me, check my mom's phone." Everyone stilled. Judge Simmons raised a brow. "Explain." Lily swallowed hard. "She took pictures, every time, to show what he did." Vanessa gasped. Mr. Walsh looked stunned. "Your Honor, this is new information." "Then we check it," the judge said firmly. He turned to the bailiff. "Retrieve Mrs. Reeves's phone." Daniel's confidence cracked. He turned to his lawyer. "Stop this. Do something." His lawyer didn't move. A bailiff approached Vanessa, speaking softly. Hands trembling, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. It was unlocked. No hesitation, no secrecy. She handed it over. The bailiff approached the judge, handing him the device. Judge Simmons scrolled for only a few moments before his expression darkened. He turned the screen so the courtroom could see. Gasps echoed through the room. Bruises, scratches, finger-shaped marks on tiny arms. Some fresh, some faded. Some so deep they turned sickening shades of purple and yellow. And timestamps. Dozens of them. Every injury, documented. Weeks, months, some dating back more than a year. Daniel's face drained of color. Vanessa's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, I formally request that the charges against my client be dismissed immediately." Daniel's lawyer stammered. "These could have been staged." "Enough," the judge snapped. The weight in his voice silenced the entire room. He looked at Mr. Walsh. "Do you wish to proceed with your case against Mrs. Reeves?" Mr. Walsh was already shaking his head. He had built his career on winning, but he had no interest in fighting for the wrong side. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded. Then he turned his full attention to Daniel Reeves. The room held its breath. Judge Simmons' next words would change everything. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Judge Simmons flipped through the file, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. The air was heavy with anticipation, every eye locked onto the aging judge as he absorbed the new information. The courtroom, already rattled by Lily's testimony, now teetered on the edge of something much bigger. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, his fists still clenched. The confident businessman, the devoted father, the man who had painted himself as the hero of this case, now he just looked cornered. His lawyer, sensing the shift in the room, leaned in. "We don't know what's in that file," he whispered urgently. "Stay calm." But Daniel was unraveling. His foot tapped anxiously against the floor, and his fingers twitched as he fought the urge to grab the file from the judge's hands. Judge Simmons exhaled, placing the papers down with slow deliberation. His eyes lifted, sharp and unreadable. "Mr. Walsh," he said, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Did your team request additional records on Mr. Reeves?" Mr. Walsh adjusted his tie. "Not formally, Your Honor," he admitted. "But given the accusations made today, I imagine certain agencies took an interest." Daniel's lawyer scoffed. "This is a witch hunt. We are being blindsided by information we haven't had the chance to review." Judge Simmons ignored him. His attention remained fixed on the file in front of him. "Mr. Reeves," he said slowly, "do you have any knowledge of a prior restraining order filed against you 5 years ago?" The shift in the courtroom was instant. Gasps, murmurs, a stunned hush. Vanessa's head snapped up. Even Mr. Walsh, always composed, looked momentarily caught off guard. Daniel, however, didn't flinch. If anything, he forced himself to look unfazed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." His voice was even, but there was an edge to it, a defensive sharpness that hadn't been there before. Judge Simmons wasn't convinced. He lifted a page from the file, adjusting his glasses as he read aloud. 5 years ago, a woman named Rebecca Turner filed a restraining order against you in the state of Colorado. She cited physical intimidation, verbal threats, and—" He paused, his expression darkening further. "Instances of physical harm, particularly in the presence of her son." Another murmur rippled through the courtroom. Vanessa's breathing grew unsteady. She turned to her lawyer, eyes wide. "I never knew about this." Daniel's jaw clenched. "Because it never happened," he snapped. "This is ridiculous." Mr. Walsh cut in, his voice razor sharp. "Your Honor, do we have confirmation that this restraining order was upheld?" The bailiff, still standing near the judge's bench, cleared his throat. "Yes, sir. It was approved by a Colorado judge, and Mr. Reeves was ordered to maintain a 50-foot distance from Ms. Turner and her child at all times." Daniel shot out of his chair. "That was a false claim. The woman was crazy." The gavel slammed down. "Sit. Down." Daniel hesitated but dropped into his seat, seething. His lawyer was visibly rattled now, flipping through his notes as if some legal technicality might undo the damage. Judge Simmons wasn't finished. He lifted another document. "There's more." The room held its breath. "Following the restraining order, Ms. Turner relocated and changed her name. However, recent investigative efforts have tracked her down. She was contacted late last night." He turned a page. "She agreed to provide a sworn affidavit and named Daniel Reeves as her abuser." A heavy silence fell. Daniel's face drained of color. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. Vanessa covered her mouth, shaking her head. "He did this before." Her voice cracked. "And no one stopped him." Mr. Walsh's expression hardened. "Your Honor, this changes everything. Not only does this establish a pattern of abuse, but it also calls into question every single claim Mr. Reeves has made in this case. I request an immediate injunction on his custodial rights." Daniel's lawyer shot to his feet. "This is absurd. This has nothing to do with the current case." "It has everything to do with the current case," Mr. Walsh fired back. "Mr. Reeves painted himself as a concerned father. He accused his ex-wife of neglect and abuse. He filed reports. He stood here in this courtroom swearing that he was protecting his daughter." He turned, gesturing toward Lily, who sat quietly in the witness chair, her small frame dwarfed by the enormity of the moment. "And yet today we've heard the truth from the only person who actually matters in this case." Daniel's breath came fast, shallow. He looked around as if searching for an escape. The polished facade was cracking, and for the first time the courtroom saw him not as the charming, successful man he had pretended to be, but as something much darker. Judge Simmons straightened in his seat. "I've seen enough." A final pause, the calm before the inevitable storm. "Bailiff, escort Mr. Reeves into custody for further investigation." The words hit like a thunderclap. The room exploded with noise. The sound of chairs scraping, hushed exclamations, a faint sob from someone in the jury. Daniel reeled back. "What?" Two uniformed officers moved toward him. His chair screeched against the floor as he stood abruptly. "You can't do this! This is a setup! You're ruining my life!" Judge Simmons didn't blink. "You did that yourself, Mr. Reeves." As the officers reached for him, Daniel jerked away. "I will sue this entire court. Do you hear me? You won't get away with this." But no one was listening anymore. Vanessa's breath hitched as she clutched Lily's hand, holding her daughter close. Tears welled in her eyes, not just from relief, but from the sheer exhaustion of fighting a battle no one believed she could win. Daniel struggled as the officers finally grabbed his arms, restraining him. His face twisted with rage, his mask completely gone. As they dragged him toward the exit, Lily finally spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "I told you he always lies." Daniel whipped his head toward her, eyes wild. But there was nothing left to say. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. The moment Judge Simmons spoke, the courtroom detonated into chaos. Gasps, whispers, and the rustling of papers filled the air as people absorbed the revelation. A restraining order, filed years before, by another woman. Vanessa clutched the edge of the defense table, her face drained of color. She had spent years doubting herself, questioning if she was the problem, if she had misread the warning signs. But now, the truth was laid bare for all to see. She had never been the first. Mr. Walsh, normally composed, looked genuinely caught off guard. His sharp mind, always calculating, was suddenly scrambling to process the bombshell just dropped into the case. He flipped through his papers, as if somehow this crucial piece of information had slipped through the cracks. "No, Your Honor," he admitted, his voice tight. "I was not aware of this restraining order." Daniel's lawyer sat frozen, his normally tanned face now ghostly white. His fingers twitched as he reached for his notes, desperate for something, anything, that could counteract the damage. But what could he possibly say? His client had just been exposed as a repeat offender. Vanessa inhaled sharply, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew." Daniel had hidden this from her. He had built his life on lies, spinning a web so intricate that no one had thought to look deeper. Not even the system that was supposed to protect children. But Lily, sitting on the witness stand, had never needed proof. She had always known. She sat up straighter, her small hands gripping the armrests. "I told you," she said, her voice unwavering. "He lies." The statement sliced through the noise like a blade. The room stilled. Daniel's jaw tightened. He clenched his fists, knuckles turning white, but he didn't speak. For the first time since the trial had started, he didn't have an immediate excuse. Judge Simmons adjusted his glasses, flipping through the newly received documents with slow precision. The way his expression darkened with each page sent another ripple of unease through the courtroom. "The restraining order," he continued, his tone now heavier, "was filed by a woman named Rebecca Turner in the state of Colorado. The claims include physical abuse, intimidation, and repeated threats. Her son was listed as a secondary protected party." Another sharp inhale from Vanessa, a flicker of something in Mr. Walsh's eyes. Disgust, regret, disbelief. Daniel's lawyer finally found his voice, though it wavered. "Your Honor, that case is irrelevant to these proceedings. There is no direct correlation between—" "No direct correlation," Mr. Walsh cut in, his voice laced with disbelief. "Your client accused his ex-wife of child abuse and used past injuries as evidence, all while having a prior restraining order for the exact same allegations?" Daniel's lawyer opened his mouth, then snapped it shut. Judge Simmons continued reading. "Ms. Turner testified that Mr. Reeves had violent outbursts, often targeting their child when he was upset." He looked up, his gaze now piercing. "Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" No one spoke. Daniel shifted in his chair. His jaw twitched, his nostrils flared, his control was slipping, his well-crafted persona unraveling thread by thread. Vanessa turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Anger, betrayal, and something deeper, something harder to define. "You did this to someone else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you still tried to make me look like the monster." Daniel's eyes snapped to her, filled with a cold fury. "You don't know what you're talking about!" But even as he said it, his voice lacked its usual conviction. Mr. Walsh stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Daniel. "Your Honor, I believe this raises significant questions about Mr. Reeves' credibility." Judge Simmons nodded. "You believe?" He tapped a finger against the restraining order. "This is no longer about credibility. This is about a pattern of behavior." A heavy silence followed. Daniel's lawyer straightened, desperate to salvage what was left. "Your Honor, we have no way of verifying Ms. Turner's claims." "Then let's verify them." The room held its breath. Judge Simmons turned to the bailiff. "Contact Ms. Turner. If she's willing, I want her statement today." Daniel shot out of his chair. "You can't do that." The judge barely spared him a glance. "I can, and I will. Sit down, Mr. Reeves." Daniel hesitated, his breath coming fast and shallow. He wasn't just losing control of the narrative. He was losing everything. Slowly, stiffly, he sank back into his chair. Lily, still on the witness stand, didn't flinch. She had spent months trapped in fear. She had lived in a world where speaking up meant consequences. But now, with her father's lies finally coming undone, she was no longer afraid. The judge set the file down. His expression was unreadable, but his next words made it clear where this was going. "This court will not be manipulated." Daniel said nothing, but the way he gripped the table told everyone exactly what he was thinking. And for the first time since the trial had begun, he looked afraid. The air in the courtroom had shifted. Gone was the smug, untouchable Daniel Reeves, the man who had walked into this trial with the arrogance of someone certain he would win. Gone was the carefully crafted illusion of the devoted father, the responsible parent, the victim. Now, all that remained was a man who had been cornered. Judge Simmons' stare was unrelenting, piercing through Daniel's defenses like a scalpel cutting through flesh. "Do you deny these allegations?" For a split second, Daniel hesitated. Then he straightened his spine, forced his features into an indignant scowl, and scoffed. "This is a smear campaign, a desperate attempt to discredit me." "Enough!" the judge snapped, slamming his gavel down with a force that sent a sharp crack through the courtroom. The sound reverberated in the tense air, cutting Daniel off mid-sentence. Daniel flinched. Judge Simmons didn't look away. "Mr. Reeves, we are issuing an immediate investigation." The statement landed like a bomb. Gasps rippled through the audience. Vanessa sucked in a sharp breath, one hand flying to her mouth. Even Mr. Walsh, who had been pressing for this moment, looked taken aback by how swiftly the judge had moved. But no one was more affected than Daniel. His mask cracked, the first sliver of true fear flashing in his eyes. His lawyer reacted first, jumping up so fast that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Your Honor!" Silence. The single word was like a steel wall slamming down. Daniel's lawyer paled, his mouth opening and closing as he debated whether to push back. But something in Judge Simmons' tone, a warning, an unshakable finality, made him think twice. Slowly, stiffly, he sank back into his seat, though his fingers twitched against the table. Daniel, however, wasn't ready to surrender. His jaw clenched, nostrils flaring. "This is absurd." His voice was strained now, the first cracks appearing in his once unshakable confidence. "You're taking the word of a child." Judge Simmons cut him off. "A child who provided consistent testimony. A child whose injuries align with her statements. A child whose mother documented every mark, every bruise, every late-night hospital visit." Each word was a nail in Daniel's coffin. Daniel's fingers dug into the wooden table. "You have no real proof, and that is why we are investigating," the judge said, his tone sharp, unwavering. "Because if you are innocent, you have nothing to fear. But if you are lying..." He let the sentence hang in the air, letting the weight of it settle over the room. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Mr. Walsh stood, his stance composed, but his voice edged with an undeniable steel. "Your Honor, given these developments, I request that all custody arrangements involving Mr. Reeves be immediately suspended until the investigation is concluded." Daniel's lawyer shot up again. "That's outrageous." Judge Simmons barely glanced at him. "Denied. The request stands." Daniel's lips parted, a furious rebuttal ready on his tongue, but before he could speak, the judge turned to the bailiff. "Ensure that all necessary files on Mr. Reeves are pulled immediately. Any past accusations, reports, or related complaints, whether dismissed or not, are to be thoroughly reviewed." Daniel's composure shattered. "This is a goddamn witch hunt!" Judge Simmons' eyes flashed. "Watch your tone, Mr. Reeves." Daniel's chest heaved. He was losing control. He knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. The confident, polished businessman who had once commanded the room was unraveling at an alarming rate. Vanessa stared at him, her expression unreadable. Maybe, somewhere deep inside, a small part of her had wanted to believe he wouldn't go this far. To lie. To manipulate. To turn their daughter's suffering into a legal weapon against her. But now, there was no doubt. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was who he was. Lily, still in the witness chair, watched Daniel with quiet, unblinking intensity. He must have felt it, because suddenly he turned his glare to her. "You did this." His voice was low, dangerous. Vanessa was on her feet before she even realized it. "Don't you dare talk to her." A sharp command. Not pleading. Not afraid. Daniel's head snapped back toward her, nostrils flaring, but something stopped him from speaking. Maybe it was the realization that, for the first time, Vanessa wasn't the one crumbling under his words. She was the one standing. The judge's gavel slammed once more. "Bailiff, remove Mr. Reeves from this courtroom until further notice." Daniel's head whipped toward the judge. "You can't do that." "I just did." The bailiff stepped forward. Daniel jerked his arm away when the officer reached for him. "Don't touch me." His lawyer turned to him, murmuring, "Don't make it worse." But it was already worse. As Daniel stood there, seething, trapped, his world closing in, the reality hit him like a freight train. He wasn't the one in control anymore. And for a man like Daniel Reeves, that was the worst punishment of all. The courtroom was suffocatingly tense. Every breath, every movement felt amplified in the heavy silence that followed Judge Simmons's ruling. Vanessa Reeves, who had spent months drowning in accusations, sat frozen. For the first time since this nightmare began, the weight crushing her chest lifted. The court finds insufficient evidence to proceed against Vanessa Reeves. Her body sagged forward, a sob of relief escaping before she could stop it. It was over. But Judge Simmons wasn't done. He turned his gaze toward the other side of the room, his voice unwavering. Additionally, given the new allegations against Mr. Reeves, full custody of Lily Reeves is granted to her mother, pending further investigation. The shift in the room was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, the frantic scratching of pens on paper as journalists rushed to capture the moment. The jury exchanged glances, some nodding as if the decision had already been obvious. At the defense table, Vanessa covered her mouth with her hands. Lily was coming home. Across the room, Lily sat motionless in the witness chair. The words echoed in her head, full custody to her mother. Her small hands gripped the armrests as if grounding herself in reality, waiting for someone to take it back, to tell her she had imagined it. But it was real. She was free. Her eyes flickered to her mother, and for the first time in months, she saw hope. A movement at the defense table snapped the tension. Daniel Reeves had not moved. His face, flushed red with barely contained rage, was set like stone. His hands, previously resting flat on the table, curled into fists. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. His carefully constructed lie had unraveled in front of everyone. A uniformed bailiff approached, his posture firm, his voice neutral but firm. "Sir, you need to come with us." Daniel's eyes darted up, locking onto the officer with a stare that could cut glass. "This is a setup." His voice was sharp, filled with the desperation of a man watching his empire burn around him. The judge didn't react. He had seen men like Daniel before, men who thought the system would always protect them. The bailiff didn't flinch. "Sir, stand up." Daniel's nostrils flared. His fingers twitched, like he was moments away from grabbing something. His papers, the table, his lawyer's arm, anything to ground himself in the illusion that he was still in control. But he wasn't. His lawyer leaned in, voice low, urgent. "Don't fight this. We'll appeal. We'll file motions. But not if you resist." Daniel barely heard him. His heart pounded in his ears. He could feel the eyes on him, the way the jurors no longer saw a loving father but something else, something rotten. His name, his reputation, his power, all of it slipping away. And then he saw her. Lily, sitting small and silent in the witness chair, watching him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't looking away. She was waiting to see what he would do next. And for the first time, Daniel felt something foreign clawed his chest. Fear. Not of the police, not of the court. Of her. Because in that moment, he understood. She was no longer afraid of him. The realization sent a chill down his spine, twisting his fury into something uglier, something more desperate. His voice dropped to a growl. "You did this." Vanessa was on her feet in an instant. "Don't you dare talk to her." It wasn't a plea, it was a command. Daniel turned to her, teeth clenched, but she wasn't scared either. And that's when he knew he had lost. His entire body trembled as he forced himself to stand. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. The bailiff stepped closer, ready to grab him if needed. Daniel shot him a glare. "I can walk on my own." He straightened his suit, forcing a smirk onto his face as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience, as if he wasn't being escorted out of a courtroom like a criminal. But the act was thin. Everyone saw through it. The reporters scribbling furiously, the jury, some shaking their heads, even the spectators in the gallery, some of whom had believed him at the start, now looked at him with contempt. He turned toward the exit, his movements slow, deliberate. His lawyer trailed behind, already pulling out his phone, likely preparing for damage control. With each step, the silence in the room deepened. And then, just as he reached the heavy double doors, a small voice rang out. "I told you he always lies." Daniel's entire body locked up. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see Lily still sitting there, her face unreadable. For a moment, his rage boiled over. He wanted to snap, to scream, to remind her who he was. But he wasn't anyone anymore. And she wasn't afraid. The bailiff pushed the door open. Cold air from the hallway swept into the room. Daniel stepped forward. The doors slammed shut behind him. Judge Simmons adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The case was over. Lily turned to her mother, and Vanessa opened her arms. Lily ran to her without hesitation, burying her face against Vanessa's shoulder. For the first time, she let herself cry, not from fear, but from relief. Vanessa held her tight, kissing the top of her head, whispering over and over, "It's okay, baby. We're okay." And for the first time in a very long time, Lily believed it. As the heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind Daniel Reeves, it was as if a storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, unfamiliar stillness. For the first time since this nightmare began, the walls of the courtroom no longer felt like a prison. The man who had used the system to manipulate and control was gone, and the silence that followed was not one of fear, but of relief. Vanessa Reeves barely had time to process it before her knees buckled beneath her. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was months of terror, months of fighting, of being treated like a criminal, of having every moment of her life dissected, twisted, and used against her. Months of knowing the truth and screaming it into a void, only for it to fall on deaf ears. But now, finally, someone had listened. Before she could hit the floor completely, small arms wrapped around her neck. Lily. Her daughter clung to her with a desperation that shattered what little composure Vanessa had left. Her hands, trembling and weak, gripped the back of Lily's sweater, pulling her close, holding her like she was afraid she might vanish again if she let go. Tears streamed down Vanessa's face as she pressed her lips against the top of Lily's head, her sobs muffled against her daughter's soft hair. "You saved me." She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the words had tumbled out, raw and broken, as if they had been waiting for this moment all along. Lily pulled back just enough to look her mother in the eyes. Her expression wasn't one of pride or relief. It was something deeper, something that came from surviving something no child should ever have to survive. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You saved me first." Vanessa let out a choked sob, her fingers framing Lily's face, brushing her thumbs over her daughter's tear-streaked cheeks, memorizing every freckle, every piece of her that she had almost lost forever. Almost. Judge Simmons, who had been observing in silence, finally tapped his gavel against the wood one last time. His voice was steady, but there was an unusual softness in it, an understanding of the magnitude of this moment. "Court is adjourned." The words echoed like a final seal on their freedom. Around them, the courtroom began to stir. Lawyers packing their files, jurors exchanging hushed words, reporters whispering into their phones, eager to be the first to break the story. But Vanessa didn't hear any of it. She couldn't. The only thing that mattered was Lily. The only thing that mattered was that they had won. Across the room, Mr. Walsh stood frozen, gripping his briefcase like a lifeline. He had spent weeks building this case against Vanessa. He had been so sure, so convinced that he had been fighting for the right cause. But now, as he watched the mother and daughter clinging to each other, two people he had unknowingly tried to tear apart, he felt something unfamiliar. Guilt. He had trusted the wrong man. He had helped the wrong man. Vanessa must have felt his gaze because she turned her head slightly. Their eyes met, and for a moment Walsh thought she might say something. She didn't. She just held Lily closer. And really, what was left to say? Vanessa finally forced herself to stand. Her body was still weak, but she refused to let go of Lily's hand. Lily sniffled, rubbing at her red eyes with her sleeve before looking up. What happens now? Vanessa inhaled deeply. The courtroom, once a place of fear, now felt like nothing more than a building. A shell. The battle that had raged inside these walls was over. It wasn't about the court anymore. It was about them. She smoothed back Lily's hair, her fingers gentle but firm. Now, we go home. Lily hesitated. The word felt almost foreign. Home. A place she hadn't truly felt in a long time. Her small fingers twisted in the fabric of Vanessa's blazer, clinging to it like a lifeline. Together? Vanessa smiled through her tears, squeezing her daughter's hand. Always. Lily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned into her mother's side, resting her head against Vanessa's shoulder. And for the first time in months, she felt safe. For the first time in her life, she felt free. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the harsh fluorescent lights gave way to the golden hue of late-afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the courthouse lobby. Vanessa hadn't seen the sun in weeks, at least not like this. She tightened her grip on Lily's hand as they walked past the sea of reporters already gathered outside, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a chaotic frenzy. "Vanessa, do you have a statement?" "Mrs. Reeves, how does it feel to be free?" "Lily, do you want to say anything about your father?" Vanessa stopped abruptly. Lily did too, instinctively looking up at her mother for guidance. Vanessa met the eyes of the closest reporter, a woman with a microphone held just inches away. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Then she turned away, because none of these people had been there when it mattered. None of them had listened when she had begged for someone to believe her, and none of them would get to define this moment. This was hers and Lily's. As they stepped into the open air, the sun warm on their skin, Vanessa finally exhaled. She felt Lily squeeze her hand. She squeezed back. Then together they walked away, not looking back.